Now, last week I did a video discussing the rumors that an Obi-Wan Kenobi limited series will be coming to the Disney Plus streaming service probably sometime next year. And though no official announcement has been made yet, there does seem to be some evidence that points to this being a very real possibility. Not the least of which is that Ewan McGregor, who would of course be reprising his role, has seemed very open if not eager about the possibility of coming back to the role for some time now. He even made some comments recently about how he was happy the prequel seemed to be more embraced these days, as the kids they were made for have now grown up. There's also the fact that Disney seems to be talking a great deal lately about the importance of streaming and how they essentially see it as the future of entertainment, which means in order to compete with the already established services like Netflix, they'll likely pull out the big guns and produce some quality shows as quickly as they can to get people signed up and to keep them signed up, of course. And a series about Obi-Wan, again played by Ewan McGregor, is certainly going to capture the attention of a lot of Star Wars fans. Even though, let's be honest here, there are a limited number of things you can do with a show about a guy who lives as a hermit on a desert planet, and especially one who's trying very, very hard to keep a low profile. And I don't know that you can take him off planet for some sort of mission, if you will, without risking the ire of some fans who wouldn't want to see him leave his post guarding Luke for any reason at all. Not to mention, they have actually started to tackle this time period for Obi-Wan in the comic books, giving us two separate stories within the new main Star Wars line, and I'll be discussing those and what they've already established about him in this time period in just a moment. And before you say, who cares what they did in a couple of comic books, even if they are considered canon, that they can just retcon or override it for the sake of this new series, well, I really think they'll try to avoid breaking established canon if at all possible, not only for this particular series, but for any film or series down the road. Now, why do I say that? Well, because once they've done it for the first time, they'll set a precedence that they'll be willing to do it again and again and again. And let's be real here, one of the main reasons people actually read and keep up with all the books, comics, and so on is because they are canon, or part of the bigger universe. And if you take that aspect away, if you're willing to undo these stories on a whim for the sake of the quote-unquote more important stories, those who consider themselves canon junkies, and keep up with any and everything that they put out there, will be far less inclined to buy any of it. However, in regards to these particular comics about Obi-Wan, there would be a way to work around these stories if they really wanted or needed to. And that's because they're actually stories within a story. Because these tales about Obi-Wan's time on Tatooine are actually being read in the comic by Luke from a journal Obi-Wan's left specifically for him. Which in theory could mean these stories are true, but only from a certain point of view. Or that, in other words, Obi-Wan is possibly stretching the truth in them or telling Luke stories he thinks he needs to hear, but that might not be 100% accurate. And mind you, I'm not saying I like that idea, but it is a possibility for them to explore if they had to. Hell, in the series you could even have a scene where Obi-Wan is writing in the journal and decides to alter some experience he's just had. Either way though, I do think it'd be a nice touch to see him write in it at some point in the series. Anyway, let's now get to what these two stories in the comics actually establish about Obi-Wan in this time period, starting with the one that takes place in Star Wars issue number 7. And this story was a pretty simple and straightforward one that opens with and has a running inner monologue from Obi-Wan's perspective throughout. And the premise of the story is that there's a great drought on Tatooine. Yes, I said a drought, even though one might assume the planet's always experiencing a drought. Anyway, there's a drought and all of the moisture farmers are getting little or nothing from their evaporators, and they're having to deal with Jabba's goons enforcing a water tax on them and essentially leaving them to die of thirst or to have nothing to trade for food. And at first, Obi-Wan really wants nothing to do with any of this because obviously he doesn't want to be discovered. And one thing to keep in mind, and it even gets referenced at one point in the comic, is that Obi-Wan and Jabba have met before. So if he somehow got captured, Jabba would know exactly who he is and might try to sell him to the Empire or something along those lines. And so Obi-Wan is trying to ignore the plight of these moisture farmers the best he can. At one point though, Jabba's thugs come to the Lars homestead, and Obi-Wan basically chases them off by using a mind trick. Then later while in town, Obi-Wan uses the Force to cause some of the thugs' blasters to misfire when they're about to slaughter a group of innocent people. And finally, late at night, Obi-Wan feels a disturbance in the Force and realizes Luke is in trouble. And that's because Luke, and the details behind how this comes about are a little sketchy. Anyway, late at night Luke, and keep in mind he's maybe 8 or 9 years old at this time, well, he's tried to steal or take back water from some of the thugs by grabbing it off their speeder, basically telling them that it doesn't belong to them. And so Obi-Wan then shows up and, never revealing himself or igniting his lightsaber, he just uses the Force to basically dispatch them all. And when he's done, the comic ends with a moment where Obi-Wan sorta re-embraces being a Jedi again, thanks to the actions and courage of Luke, and vows that he will not be the last of his order. So again, the story itself is pretty simple and straightforward, but it's the inner monologue of Obi-Wan's, especially at the start and throughout the first several pages, that's actually the highlight of this story here, and where we learn the most about what his time on Tatooine has been like thus far. So what I'm going to do now is quickly read that monologue and then discuss it. So here goes. As hard as it was to become a Jedi, it was even harder to stop being one, but I did. By the time of the Great Drought, it had been years since I'd touched a lightsaber. Years spent hiding on Tatooine. Years spent alone. I wasn't General Obi-Wan Kenobi anymore. I was no longer a Jedi Master. I was only Ben. Quiet old Ben who lived far out in the Dune Sea, where nothing but Womp Rats and Tusken Raiders ever dared to go. Ben the Forgotten. Ben the Relic. One day blurred into the next, with little to distinguish them. Instead of Sith Lords and bounty hunters, my days were spent battling monotony and inactivity. I should have been busier than ever. I should have been training the boy. But his uncle never allowed it, and I suppose there was a part of me that couldn't blame him. The last Skywalker I tried to train was gone. They were all gone. All the Jedi, and sometimes I wondered if I should have been gone with them. But I did still have one job to do, and I did it the best I could. If I couldn't train the boy, I could at least keep him safe, and hope there would come a day when he'd realize for himself that it was meant to be more than just a farmer. Okay, even though this is short but sweet, we can actually take quite a bit away from this, or at least make a lot of fairly good assumptions. First, that he's not in contact with or communing with the Force ghost of Qui-Gon Jinn, which is one of the things we know Yoda wanted him to be doing. We know that Yoda was going to teach him how to contact Qui-Gon, and that Qui-Gon will ultimately teach Obi-Wan how to become a Force ghost, as we see happen in A New Hope. But by the way, Obi-Wan talks about being alone and how he's essentially stopped being a Jedi, not to mention how boring and monotonous he says his life has become. This leads me to believe he's having no success in contacting Qui-Gon, and hasn't as of yet. And it's probably only leading to further discouragement and pushing him further away from actually being successful. Then there's also the fact that at one point he seems to almost lament the fact that his days aren't spent fighting Sith Lords and bounty hunters anymore. And we all know from Master Yoda that adventure and excitement are things a Jedi shouldn't crave. So perhaps holding on to past glory, if you will, is a big part of his problem, as is holding on to past regret, which we know he's doing when he talks about how he failed the last Skywalker he tried to train. And speaking of training, we also learn that Uncle Owen will not let Obi-Wan train Luke, which might seem a bit odd, considering you'd think Obi-Wan would have stressed when he initially dropped Luke off, as we see in Revenge of the Sith, that one day he's going to come back for him, that one day he's going to need to be trained. But of course, we know that Luke's training won't start and that he learns absolutely nothing at all about the Force until we see him in A New Hope. In other words, you have to make up some excuse as to why Obi-Wan never started to train Luke sooner. All in all here, again, it's a good story, and I think it's kind of meant to be a transition or turning point for the character of Obi-Wan Kenobi, because when we again see him in the comics, which is a year after this book takes place, he's much different and seems to have truly embraced the ways of the Jedi again. And at a couple points during the 2 issues that make up this story, which take place in Star Wars issues number 15 and 20, he says something or notes something and says it to Qui-Gon Jinn. Now, mind you, Qui-Gon's Force Ghost doesn't show up or anything when he does this, and not just because Qui-Gon can't manifest like the others can, and nor does Qui-Gon reply in any way, shape, or form, but it does seem to suggest that Obi-Wan's now either in contact with Qui-Gon Jinn, or he's trying to be. We also, at a couple points, see Obi-Wan meditating amongst a herd of banthas, and even has given them names, which indicates this is something he does quite often. And though you might think this is a sign he's truly losing it, I think it's really meant to indicate he's trying to stay connected with the living Force. There's also some fun Easter eggs in these 2 books, like getting to see a young Biggs Darklighter, and we also get to see Luke flying his T-16 Skyhopper through Beggar's Canyon. And at one point, Obi-Wan chases away some Tusken Raiders for a group of Jawas, and after he's done, he comments about how he needs to find a better way to do that, which of course references his Krayt Dragon scream he'll eventually use in A New Hope to chase away the Tuskens who have attacked Luke. And for the most part here, this story is pretty good, but we don't really learn much or have anything actually confirmed in regards to Obi-Wan communing with Qui-Gon. The whole premise here is that Luke tries to fly through Beggar's Canyon, bangs up his Skyhopper a bit in the process, and it needs some new parts. Uncle Owen, of course, is furious at Luke, but Obi-Wan, who wants to see Luke continue to fly, and he comments at one point about how Luke is much like his father, chases away those aforementioned Tuskens for some Jawas in exchange for the parts to fix the Skyhopper. But Owen refuses to accept them, and we get a little exchange between Obi-Wan and Owen where we see just how adamant Owen is about wanting Obi-Wan to stay away from Luke because he doesn't want Luke to end up like his father. The meat of this story, though, is that Jabba is still looking for the one who attacked his thugs during the Great Drought a year ago and sends out a bounty hunter to look for them. That bounty hunter then eventually makes his way to the Lars homestead, abducts Uncle Owen, and Obi-Wan, of course, must spring to action to try and save him, though it's ultimately Luke who does the saving after Uncle Owen gets shoved off a cliff by the bounty hunter, because Luke basically catches him with a Skyhopper before he falls to his death. It then ends with Obi-Wan besting the bounty hunter, of course, before he and Owen seem to have a moment of understanding. And again, it's a good enough story, a touch cheesy at the end that Luke catches the falling Uncle Owen with the Skyhopper, but enjoyable nonetheless, even though it doesn't offer much insight into Obi-Wan's life at this point, which is ultimately a good thing for the sake of the upcoming series that hopefully can work around these two stories without retconning them. And in my opinion, maybe the best place for such a series to take place is in between these two stories, in that 1 year gap. That way it can really show the change from disgruntled hermit we saw in the first story to the one who seems to again be on the path of the Jedi in the next. And maybe by now is in contact with Qui-Gon Jinn. In fact, we can see how he establishes that contact, and hear them speak to each other for the first time. In fact, I'd be stunned if this series doesn't include that. And sure, at the end of that first story, it seems as if Obi-Wan has already made that turning point. But something else could go wrong in that year between the two stories that really tests his renewed faith. Either that or he, again, is only telling Luke the truth from a certain point of view in that journal, and it wouldn't be too difficult to work that into the story. Perhaps the series could even start with him writing in the journal, talking about the Great Drought and his confrontation with Jabba's thugs. And then again towards the end of the series, or at the bitter end, we see Obi-Wan about to start to write in the journal again, only to close it and to tell himself something to the effect that this isn't a story he'll ever need to know. Whatever they do with this series, I really hope it doesn't retcon these two stories. Not just because it begins to ruin the other sources of canon, if you will, by basically saying, we'll do away with them when and where needed, but because it was a good story about Obi-Wan, and if done right, a series could build off what they started here. Though I'm not saying you'd have to have read them to understand the series, only that they enhance it to some small degree. And I'd love if there were an Easter egg or two in the series referencing the comics, and I think the journal would be probably the best and easiest way to do that. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think. Should they ignore these comics when they make the Obi-Wan series in the interest of making the best series they possibly can? Or is it more important to keep the integrity of the already established canon? Let me know in the comments below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.